when we tried to look at the top 10 worst offenders, according to these tools, across the vendors, the tools didn't agree. They didn't agree on the 10 most impactful firms on biodiversity, and they also didn't agree on the rank order within that.
Welcome to The Greener Way. I'm your host, Michelle Baltazar, Executive Director of Media at FS Sustainability. We are recording on Gadigal land, and we pay our respects to the traditional custodians of country and elders past and present. In today's episode, we are joined by Dr. Jennifer Willett, Head of Investment Sustainability Solutions at Franklin Templeton. Jen, thanks for joining us.
Hi, Michelle. It's great to join you today.
So Jen is joining us from Edinburgh, where it's 6:30 a.m. right now as we're doing the recording. So this is what we call dedication. And the reason I thought we'd reach out to her is that she is one of the 8 authors of a recently published paper on biodiversity risk titled Making Money Talk Nicely, Biodiversity Impact Assessment for Investors. But firstly, Jen, so how did this come about?
A couple of years ago, my team, the Investment Sustainability Solutions team at Franklin Templeton, was speaking to a number of our investment teams who were interested in better understanding the biodiversity-related impacts and risks associated with their portfolios. So we started looking at what was out there in the market from a data perspective to help us understand this. And we've seen a number of vendors start to offer these metrics claiming to quantify the biodiversity footprint or biodiversity impact of an investee company. And we were a little skeptical that such a complex and nuanced issue could be boiled down into a single metric. We even had some vendors call these metrics analogous to a carbon footprint when we're thinking about climate. So, some alarm bells ring there. We know that biodiversity is multidimensional. It's location specific. It's also dependent on socio-economic context. So there really is no single KPI for measuring our impact there. So we had concerns about what was on the market. We do think these metrics can have some use. They can point us towards hotspots. So companies or sectors likely to have greater impact, but they're really going to miss that nuance of where the impacts are, which species or ecosystem services the impacts are on, or about the rarity or value. We know that species and ecosystem services are not fungible, right? So the last 10 Highland cows in existence are going to be valued very differently from the 10 that I see when I run around the park down the road from me. So all these things need to be taken into consideration. So as we were internally grappling with how to approach this through conversations with our investment teams, with some of the vendors on the market, I was lucky to be introduced to Professor Brendan Wintle from the Melbourne Biodiversity Institute. So Brendan had had some conversations with and partnered with one of our investment teams in Melbourne on a Pathway to Net Zero event. And we had some great early conversations about the challenges we're seeing. And Brendan shared our skepticism, but he also shared some hope that if we got the right people involved, we could make some progress. So at that point, we decided to partner with the Institute to try and better understand the limitations of the current tools, but ultimately with that hope that we could move towards a better framework for understanding biodiversity risks and impacts within portfolios.
And so with that, what were the results?
Yes, so the results were, I would say, not entirely surprising, but they were very interesting. So the way we approached the project was to take 8 prominent biodiversity vendors offering biodiversity impact assessment tools tailored for financial institutions. So that was the start point. Some of those vendors did explore other types of metrics, which I can talk about in a little while, but our study really focused on those biodiversity impact assessment offerings so that we were looking across and comparing apples with apples. So what we did was take the S&P 500 as a case study. We looked at those companies and rated them using each tool, allowing us to correlate those and compare the findings. And we actually found that the correlation between the ratings of the companies within the S&P 500 was pretty low. There were a couple of tools that were more highly correlated, but there was a pretty huge span. And I think the most striking result, and the thing that I talk about the most because I think it's really telling, is that when we tried to look at the top 10 worst offenders, according to these tools, across the vendors, the tools didn't agree. They didn't agree on the 10 most impactful firms on biodiversity, And they also didn't agree on the rank order within that. I think the highest level of agreement we had when looking at absolute metrics was on ExxonMobil. Probably not a huge surprise, but even that only appeared in the top 10 worst offenders for 4 of the tools. So that to me is the kind of key headline takeaway. And what it tells me is that if you as an investor are trying to use these tools and rely simply on one metric to create a portfolio that's maybe taking a best-in-class approach or an exclusionary approach, that's going to be highly dependent on which vendor you've chosen to partner with. You're going to get a different portfolio composition depending on the tool you chose, which really suggests that we do need to proceed with caution here, especially when we see, creation of products out there which have biodiversity in the title and are dependent on these. I think we really need to be careful about what the real world impact is of incorporating these metrics and also making sure that they are genuinely reflecting investor preferences when it's such a nuanced issue.
I know that you say all of this with a level tone, but how it's translating in my brain right now is that suddenly you could be 100% wrong in terms of how you're measuring biodiversity risk because there's no consistency across all the competitors. You'd like to have some sort of solid correlation across the board. So with that in mind, I just want to remind our listeners right now, for those who are unfamiliar with Franklin Templeton, I mean, you manage 1.3 trillion US dollars in assets. So there's a lot at stake here in trying to really understand biodiversity risk. So you've now identified through this paper that there's inconsistency. What are the possible solutions for investors?
The first thing I would say is that these tools aren't necessarily all wrong. So one thing that's important is to understand where those differences might be coming from, which can be helpful if you did choose to select one of the tools. So areas where the differences can come from is, what impact pressures are being included. So some may consider land use change or marine, some may not. What level of value chain is being integrated? Some try to model value chains, some don't, and just focus on direct operations. And there's also differences in the types of underlying models used for these. So there are reasons for the differences. However, we did try and dig into those, and it's very challenging to pinpoint it, given that a lot of these operate in a non-transparent way. They're a little black box, which we understand these vendors, it's their proprietary tool they're trying to sell. They don't want us to be able to just recreate them internally. So we understand that, but I think it is important to note that these vendors are trying to help us grapple with this issue. So they're not 100% wrong, and it's important to understand where the differences come from. So where should we start? So I think the paper makes a couple of recommendations, and the approach that we're trying to take is to take more of a holistic approach. So we're not relying on a single metric. We are partnering with one of the vendors we looked at, Nature Alpha, who offer what I'd call more of a holistic offering with different data points. So they do have a footprinting metric, but what they're also bringing in is a geospatial solution. So overlaying asset locations with information about key biodiversity sensitive areas, for example. They're also bringing in information about unmanaged risk from companies. So looking at, okay, if a company does have higher risk or impact related to nature, what are they doing to understand that? What are they doing to mitigate that? Do they have policies in place? Do they have a transition plan in place? And we think that's a really interesting place to start. So we have that data. We're also bringing in other open source data. I think Encore is a great open source tool and a good starting point for those earlier in this. What Encore can do is look at a portfolio and pinpoint where those more material risks may be from a industry or sub-industry perspective. So, you can point towards, yes, you may have an investment in a company that is exposed to copper mining. That's likely to have impact on water pollution. Whereas if we're in the agriculture space, those material risks are more likely to be related to land use change or soil pollution. So you can start to focus in. This is still looking at sectoral averages. So, you still don't have that spatial specificity there. You still don't really understand company mitigation efforts, but I think this can be a good start to pinpoint those companies to focus more deeply in on. And then you can think about, okay, well, what other data points might be helpful for me given the kinds of operations of this company? So, if you have an investee company that's flagging as higher risk and they are in a water intensive sector, you can start thinking about, what data do I have about the water consumption of that company? Where is it located? Is it operating in an area of potential water scarcity? Does it have a water management plan? Does it have a policy on this? So we can start to build a framework for these nuanced issues of the types of questions and data points we should be asking dependent on the materiality of that particular company. And that's the approach we're trying to take. So it gets us to more of a dashboard, bringing in multiple data points. So we're not all the way at that simplistic side of one single metric that is losing the nuance, but we're also trying to narrow it down. So we're not at 100 plus metrics that we're going to get lost in. There's a middle ground that we're striving towards. And within that middle ground, you can get to something of a scorecard, which then can pinpoint to our investment teams, okay, here is where we think more analysis is needed. And then, the good news is we're going to keep our jobs, because at some point we need a human to go in and dig into that in detail. And one other point that I haven't mentioned yet is on the engagement side. So I think starting to have conversations with investee companies is a fantastic place to start. And not only the laggards, speaking to those companies who are more aware of these issues and have already started the work can be extremely informative on how to take conversations with other companies or understand better what to be looking for in certain industries.
So it's good to have a framework and not just rely on one tool, as you've said. I mean, not all tools are created equal, and you want to choose what makes sense. Now, moving away from what the portfolio manager can do or what the company can do, what about regulation? What are ways we can improve biodiversity risk measurement through the government, through government-based initiatives, for example?
So I think regulation and disclosure requirements do have a part to play here. However, I think there are two areas of risk with that. If we see regulation as the driver for making improvements in this area, and I think the first risk is that it becomes more of a tick box exercise. So, filling in reporting requirements, dedicating resources to those reporting requirements rather than actually integrating this into the investment process. And I think that's something that we've seen happen, or we've been at risk of happening in other areas when it comes to sustainability regulation. And the second half of that is the divergence between jurisdictions can put us in a challenging position. We're a large global asset manager. We operate in many regions. We have investee companies in many regions, and we also have clients in many regions. So we're captured by the majority of regional regulation and reporting requirements that can pull us in many directions. And there are challenges with consistency of the data points we'll be looking for. So I think one of the things that gives me hope there is the new focus of the ISSB on integrating nature within their standards. I think if we can get to a more standardized disclosure framework, it will be extremely helpful for us as investors and for our investee companies. So, we have representatives on the investor advisory group of the ISSB from Franklin Templeton and have previously had from our subsidiaries. And I think being part of those conversations will be key going forward.
So looking ahead, where are the strongest emerging opportunities for investors who are looking for investments or companies that are, let's say, ahead of the game when it comes to incorporating biodiversity risk into their business models?
I think one of the biggest opportunities we have is to make this more of our business as usual. So again, this isn't additional or an extra tick box. This is financially material, and it should be part of good investment management. So where we can make progress with creating simple enough, but also nuanced enough tools that take into account the various dimensions of this risk. If we can get portfolio managers looking at that on a regular basis as part of their process, I think that's huge. And it may not sound, as aspirational driving for nature positive solutions, which I think there's a lot of work to be done there too, don't get me wrong. I just think if we can get this risk management as part of BAU, we're in a really strong position. And I think one of the challenges there is that investors are pulled in so many directions. There are so many market forces. There are so many things to consider on a day-to-day basis. And I'm not just talking about it from a sustainability perspective, from geopolitics to technological disruption. We all know what the themes have been over the last few years. So it's making this come to life, and also for portfolio managers and analysts who may be more traditional in the way they approach things. And I think that's where bringing things back to financial materiality and having a strong understanding of how to communicate these issues to investors will be key.
Once again, Jen, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much. It's been great to chat.
This is The Greener Way. I'm Michelle Baltazar. Thank you for listening.
The Greener Way podcast is a product of FS Sustainability. All information in this podcast is for education and entertainment purposes only. It is not intended as a substitute for professional, legal, or tax advice. Before making any financial decisions, you should read the product disclosure statement, and if necessary, consult a licensed financial professional. For more information, head to the disclaimer page on the FS Sustainability website, fssustainability.com.au.